good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor Jessica Calarco and Heidi Stevens. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for tonight's introductions. Jessica Calarco is a sociologist and associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an award-winning teacher, and a leading expert on inequalities in family life and education. Her research focuses on education, families, and health decision-making. She's interested in the structures of power and privilege that maintain socioeconomic, racial, and gender inequalities in these settings, as well as the role that qualitative methods can play in uncovering those mechanisms. Heidi Stevens is a Chicago-based writer and the creative director of Parent Nation, an initiative of the University of Chicago's TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, which works to provide parents, caregivers, and communities the knowledge and tools to optimize foundational brain development in all children. Prior to joining the University of Chicago, Heidi worked at the Chicago Tribune for 23 years, where she wrote a daily column called Balancing Act, now a nationally syndicated weekly column. Heidi has also served on the FAN Board of Directors since September of 2021, and we're lucky to have her. And now let's welcome Jessica Calarco and Heidi Stevens.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hi.
Thank you, Lonnie. I'm so incredibly grateful for FAN and all the work that you do to bring us these phenomenal speakers and ideas week after week, all for free. It's kind of amazing. And thank you, Jessica, so much for joining us tonight. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. This is such a treat to be here with you all. And thanks certainly to FAN and to Lonnie for hosting me and for having and for putting together this conversation.
So for folks who maybe haven't had a chance to read the book yet, just maybe start off by setting the stage for us. What is, just sort of the general premise of the book?
Yeah, so other countries have invested in policies that help people to live with dignity and access opportunities and contribute to a shared project of care. And in the US, instead, we inspect people to essentially DIY society. We tell them they should be able to take care of themselves and their families without relying on the government for support. And the reality, though, is that we can't just DIY society. Some people, like the children and the sick and the elderly in our communities, can't always take care of themselves. And some jobs don't pay enough for people to get by on. And acknowledging these realities would essentially destroy this illusion of the DIY society. But the US, I argue in the book, manages to maintain that illusion by relying on women to fill in the gaps in our social safety net and the gaps in our economy too. I mean, women, in the US, for example, do roughly twice as much unpaid care work as men do. And women, disproportionately women of color, also do the bulk of the underpaid caregiving labor, things like childcare and home health care, which are among the lowest paid jobs in the economy as a whole. And I show in the book how all of that unpaid and underpaid labor is really crushing women, particularly women from systematically marginalized groups who often have nowhere to turn for support in managing all of that responsibility that they've been handed, and also nowhere to hide when others ask them to do even more. Though at the same time, I also show that even relatively privileged women are struggling under this system because even if they're able to afford to outsource some of their care responsibilities, there's just too much to manage under this DIY model, and the men around them rarely have incentive to help them pick up the slack. And this raises the question, well, why haven't we fixed this? If we know that this is doing so much damage. And that's where I turn in the second half of the book, which is looking at essentially the myths that we've been sold. Myths like the myth of meritocracy and the myth of Mars and Venus and the myth of the supermom. And I show how these myths have deluded many Americans into believing that we don't need a social safety net, and how they also operate to keep us divided, to divide us by race and class and gender and politics in ways that keep us from coming together to demand the kind of social safety net that would, better support all of us.
Well, you also do such an excellent job of explaining how we got here and who it benefits for us to not do anything about that. Before we
Mhm.
get into that, and I want to let you talk a lot about that. I hope that you'll talk a lot about that. I think it's worth pointing out that this issue is not new, right? And which in itself is kind of radical for some people. I think there's this notion that women kind of like got liberated and just started working in the 80s. Like all of a sudden there's like Michael Keaton's playing Mr. Mom and Dan Keaton's like carrying a baby like a briefcase and oh, women go to work. But women, especially women of color, have been working outside the home without any kind of support system in place since the founding of the country. And in the premise of your book, even you talk about, a national childcare system, which would have been, the makings of a social safety net that Congress voted to fund in the 40s, right? 1942. So these are not new issues. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, this is a challenge that we have run up against, time and again throughout our history. I mean, when it comes to, World War II, for example, what the men of the War Manpower Commission figured out was that we needed as many women in the workforce as possible. And certainly there were already, as you alluded to, Heidi, many women who were already working for pay, disproportionately low income women, women of color, immigrant women who had no choice but to be working for pay to support their families. But at the same time, and with so many men off fighting in battle, the US needed more women, and particularly middle class white women who at the time were disproportionately staying home with their own children, to join the workforce. And at first they thought, well, maybe just a propaganda campaign. We just need to tell women that it's their patriotic duty to come and join the workforce. But maybe not surprisingly, that effort fell short because really the challenge was childcare, as the
Right.
same as it is today. And what it took was ultimately having Congress allocate funds from the Lanham Act, which was essentially defense spending in the sense that this was money that was intended for building infrastructure in key defense production like kind of areas of the country. And certain key players in government were able to persuade Congress that that money should and could be allocated to build childcare centers and to staff, essentially, full-time, high quality, well-trained childcare centers that provided in some cases up to 12 hours a day or even overnight care for children, also summer care for kids and after school care for older kids, as a way to make it possible for mothers to work for pay. And this was, not only affordable, it was less than $10 per day in today's dollars that these
Wow.
centers cost families, but also highly effective. The families that benefited from this, very much liked the programs that they were part of. We saw massive increases in the percentages of mothers who were working for pay. And many of the women who benefited from this program wanted it to continue when the war ended. But unlike many of our European counterparts who had similar programs in place and who used the war as a sort of pivot point to invest even more fully in these kinds of programs and to further expand with things like universal paid family leave and with universal health care, kind of providing a stronger and stronger support system, we very much went the other way. And we prioritized essentially short-term profits over people and certainly over women's ability to stay in the paid economy, making it so that we would kind of free up those jobs for men, which, reduced competition and made it easier for companies to think about just staffing what they currently had, as opposed to trying to figure out how do we afford the higher taxes that would be needed, to maintain this child care center, system over time, let alone expand it with other kinds of kind of paid leave systems or other types of supports that our European counterparts were putting in place. And I trace this in the book back to kind of the 1930s and the kind of I'm happy to get into that more if you think that'd be a useful place to go. And in terms of the sort of businesses and billionaires that have long directed our economy and
Yeah.
that have played a sort of outsized role in shaping the direction that we go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I kept thinking of the Gloria Steinem quote as I was reading your book. The truth will set us free, but first it'll piss us off. um, and one of the things that I hope and I think the book sets us free from is some of the guilt that comes with trying to be a caretaker, right? Of children, of elderly parents, of loved ones who are sick, any kind of care work in a country that really just doesn't value care work because you realize as you're reading like, oh, this is a setup, and not a setup for me to succeed, right? So I don't know if you set out to help people feel a little liberated from the guilt, but it certainly did that for me because you realize like this is actually a system. It's just not a system that works for for women or for people who live on the margins?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this. A good friend of mine coined the idea that sociology is a force for ungaslighting, in the sense that it oftentimes helps to uncover the deeper social systems and the deeper
Yeah.
social realities that shape our day-to-day lives in ways that we're often not fully aware of. And so I think that's one of my goals with the book, was to help people to see, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where we have so much guilt? You know, what the research shows is that mothers in the US do experience more guilt than women in other high-income countries, in part
Right.
because we put so much on the individual, and we tell people, oh, you should just be able to do it yourself, in a way that, simply doesn't work with the realities of care. And so I think thinking of it as a setup isn't wrong, that this is a system that was designed to exploit women for the gain of, billionaires and big corporations, to make it easier for them to get away with not paying higher taxes, whether that was in the 1930s and in the wake of, the New Deal, or in the 1940s and 50s in the wake of World War II, and not wanting to invest in those social safety nets. Or, I trace this all the way forward to things like Build Back Better, and how we got very close to investing in these kinds of sturdier social safety net programs. But ultimately, it was kind of big money that killed the bill.
Well, you talked to tons and tons of families for this book. I know it was something like 400 hours of interviews over 4 years, and national surveys with 2,000 parents all over the country. And it was a demographically and politically diverse group of families, right? Were there some common themes that came up that families were struggling with or facing anyway?
Yeah, so this book, I mean, this is not the book I intended to write with
Yeah.
these data, in the sense that, so I started this project back in 2018. At the time, I was interested, I had my own two small children at home, and I was interested in what I thought of at the time as sort of the best laid plans of parenthood, where, you have these ideas about the way that you want to raise your children, and then life often intervenes in surprising and sometimes deeply frustrating ways. And so I worked with a team of grad students to recruit 250 pregnant people. They all identify as women, so I mostly talk about them that way, from prenatal clinics, all in Indiana to start with, though some of them have moved elsewhere since then. And we started following those 250 families and checking in with them every 6 months, when they were pregnant, and then when they had a newborn, and then when they had a toddler, and kind of going forward from there. With surveys and in-depth interviews about their experiences for those who were willing to stay part of the project. And we were still in the field with that project when the pandemic hit. And it was, so obvious so quickly how much of an impact COVID closures and sort of the general sort of instability of our society and our economy, how much of an impact this was having on families with young children, and especially on the women within those families who disproportionately became the default parent. I mean, many of them were already in that role where they were the stopgap when, there was a snow day, or the kids got sick, or something came up last minute. And this was, one of the common themes was that for many of the families that we talked to, couples didn't even talk about who was going to be the one to provide that care for children, let alone, make sure that grandma got her meds, and make sure that neighbors got meals when they got sick, and make sure that colleagues had someone to fill in for them. That work just fell to women by default, even in this moment of crisis where we could have learned so much. And so I think that was, one of the biggest takeaways from these data, and part of what drove me to want to write this book, in the sense of trying to figure out, how did we get here? How did we fail so miserably? And why didn't we learn more, from this moment where maybe we could have and should have?
Right. One of the things that struck me, when you were talking about those kinds of conversations or decisions that in some cases aren't even really conversations or decisions, it's just sort of a given, a default that the woman will take on that labor, is the equation that so many families do. And I did this in my first marriage. You look at what the wife makes and the husband makes, and you say, well, she doesn't make that much, so it doesn't really make sense for her. Half her paycheck's going to go to childcare anyway, or 3/4 of her paychecks are going to go to childcare anyway. Why keep working? Instead of, collectively we make X, right? And some percentage of it will go to childcare. It's like somehow her paycheck even is what's responsible for childcare. Like, to talk a little bit about that, because when I read it, I was kind of like, why is this blowing my mind? That should have probably occurred to me earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this is the calculus for so many families in the sense that because of the sort of gendered structure of our economy, and the way that women in particular are sort of socialized for caregiving roles from the time they're old enough to hold a baby doll, they're often pushed into the kinds of devalued labor, labor as teachers, as social workers, as childcare providers, as nurses, that when you stack it up compared to the kinds of jobs held by men with similar levels of education, it typically pays less. And so what that means is that for many couples, when they do run up against the childcare crisis, when they realize, how much childcare is going to cost, or when they realize that they're going to have to be on a wait list for a year before they can get their kid into a childcare spot, then it becomes this calculus of not, how much money do we have combined, but it often is this calculus of, okay, what is the woman making? And is that enough to justify the cost of childcare or to justify, how long we're going to have to figure out something in the interim? And that's one of the mechanisms that leads many women not only to leave the workforce, but to drop back into part-time labor or to become that one that is willing to sacrifice their career, even if they are still working for pay full-time, to become that default care provider, because at least within the family budget and the family calculus, there's this sort of discounting of women's earnings. I talked to one dad for the book who I call Dennis, who he makes about $90,000 a year working in IT. And before their kids were born, his wife was making about $30,000 a year as a social worker. And so, when their kids were born, he first, they first decided that they had trouble finding a childcare spot and it was very expensive. And so the first thing they did was that she switched to a flex work arrangement where she was able to work from home a couple days a week and also have the baby at home with her. And, and then grandma came for a couple days a week. And maybe not surprisingly, this arrangement was, deeply exhausting for Bethany, the wife and the family. And many of us learned during COVID how exhausting and impossible it is to have small kids at home and also to work for pay full time. And she was living this, back in 2016. And, so he, in the process, Dennis was able to persuade Bethany, well, you're making dirt anyway. These are his words. He said, you're making dirt anyway, and now you're exhausted all the time. Why don't you just leave the workforce? Like, I'm making enough that, I can support us. And that's the sort of slippery slope calculus for so many of the women that we talked to who did end up either getting pushed out of the workforce or pushed into very part-time jobs that maybe they wanted to go back. I mean, Bethany talked about the isolation and the frustration that she felt, being at home full time with the kids, and wanted to find a way to go back to full-time paid work, but felt a lot of pressure, and also just felt like I'm probably going to still have to be doing the bulk of the housework, the bulk of the child care, the bulk of the, elder care labor for family members on top of, paid work if I do make that choice. And so this then becomes a sort of way of gaslighting women into feeling like it just maybe does make more sense to stay home full time if they're facing that pressure. And, I talk in the book a bit about how, it's easy to sort of see men as the villain when, like Dennis, they sort of promote this, like, you'll just be happier at home kind of messaging. But given these kinds of gendered inequalities, it's not surprising that men have an interest in kind of pushing that work onto women. And one of the things that maybe troubling things that I find is that for men, that kind of gender inequality in our system also incentivizes them to listen to that kind of rhetoric, to that sort of gender essentialist rhetoric, because it allows them to feel like good guys. They don't want to feel like bad guys if they're relying on the women around them to do a disproportionate share of the caregiving. But if they can believe, well, she's just happiest at home, or, it's just best for the kids if she's at home, then it becomes much easier to accept what Dennis actually talked about is that the perks of having a stay-at-home wife, like not having to help with the kids or the laundry or things like that too.
Right. I remember Dennis from the book. He talked about how, she was losing her hair from the stress of being at work. And so wouldn't it be better to not be working anymore? But you talk about, back to the social safety net and the lack of one, you talk about it. It's not enough to simply tell men to do more or ask men to do more, incentivize men to do more. That's not really a solution either.
Yeah. And I think this gets at the idea that, and certainly that is, well, oftentimes when I talk to people about this book, they're like, well, how do we just get men to step up? And I think what's important to recognize there is that our system is stacked in such a way that there isn't an incentive for men to do more, just as, there isn't an incentive, for women who make enough money, there's an incentive to outsource as much care as possible, hiring childcare workers, hiring home, someone to clean your house for you, getting meals delivered or getting meals cooked for you. In a similar way, men even if they earn enough money, have an incentive, given the pressures that our DIY society places on people to support themselves and earn as much money as possible. And so
Mhm.
under that context, we also have to worry about, if we just tell men to do more, one of the troubling things on that front is that it can put women at risk, especially if they become the sort of police of that system. If they have to be the
Right.
ones to teach or remind or nag their partners to do more, it can put them at risk of, certainly gaslighting, and in some cases even at risk of violence or at risk of, mistreatment within their relationships. One of the maybe most troubling findings that came out of especially the pandemic data was seeing in one of the national surveys that we conducted, we asked parents, how often are you yelling at your kids? And dads who were able to do some of their work remotely were off the charts compared to everybody else, like almost twice
Mhm.
as likely to say that they were yelling at their kids at least once a day. And this,
Mhm.
when we dug into the qualitative data, what showed was that these were men who oftentimes didn't have a lot of experience with, spending
Mhm.
large amounts of time caring for their kids while also working for pay. And it made it extremely frustrating, in ways
Mhm.
that women, got frustrated too, but had more experience and were able to handle it, to the point where
Mhm.
some moms that we talked to actually told their partners to go back to the office because it
Mhm.
wasn't worth having them at home because dads were getting so angry that it was
Mhm.
just wreaking havoc on the kids, wreaking havoc on their home lives. And so I think we have to kind of be worried about a system where the solution is just tell people to do more without changing
Mhm.
those underlying work pressures or other incentives that they have.
Right, exactly. This may feel like a departure, but something you said reminded me of uh, a tweet from earlier this week, and I know you saw it too because I saw you weigh in really brilliantly. But someone said on Twitter, "I don't understand why nursing homes are so expensive that they bankrupt our grandparents, and yet nursing home aides are using food banks, and daycare is so expensive that it eats up one parent's entire paycheck." And yet daycare providers make like $10 an hour and need second jobs. So connect those dots for us a little bit. Like, why is that? Why is it so incredibly expensive to send your kid to daycare, so incredibly expensive to send your parent to live in assisted living, and yet the people working there barely make any money, can barely make
Yeah.
ends meet?
Yeah, no, it's
Who's
it's
getting
one
the
of those
money?
it's one of those seeming paradoxes, and certainly there's a
Right.
number of different factors going on here. But one of the things that's sometimes hardest but most important for people to wrap their heads around is the labor intensiveness of care work, in the
Yeah.
sense that, compared to many of the other types of services and types of goods that we produce in our economy, care work, especially the kind of care work for very young children and for people who have very high levels of healthcare needs or elder care needs, you're thinking, for an infant room in a child care center, that's oftentimes one staff member to four kids, which means that essentially, and that's only for 8 hours a day. If you need more than 9 to 5 care, you're going to need two
Mhm.
people in there. If you want that child care provider to be able to take a lunch break or take a bathroom break, then you need
Right.
essentially two people for every four kids. And so when you start to divide out those salaries, it's not all that different from hiring a full-time nanny if there's that few people in a classroom. And similarly with, home health aides or with, nursing home aides, it's a very similar type of calculus in terms of the level of personnel support and the amount of labor that goes into providing that kind of care. And so what that means is that there's just not a lot of wiggle room, and that it's very hard for many, whether it's childcare centers or nursing homes, to be able to simultaneously pay their workers well and keep costs low enough for the families who need
Mhm.
that kind of support without the
Yeah.
kinds of government subsidies that other
Yeah.
countries put in place to make this kind of work possible. And certainly this is a
Mhm.
place where even things like universal paid family leave could help a great deal too, because for countries that have, a year of paid family leave, for example, that means they don't need infant childcare rooms or don't need nearly as many of them. And so then
Right.
once you get to a year, it might be a 1 to 8 ratio as opposed to a 1 to 4 ratio. And that
Mhm.
dramatically changes the calculus and the cost of childcare. And this
Mhm.
is, part of why we have such a shortage of childcare in our country, and certainly high quality elder care facilities as well, is because, we, instead of relying on social safety nets, have tried to solve this problem of the labor intensiveness. We can't, it's extremely labor intensive, but we can't automate it and we can't outsource it. But we solve it instead by exploiting workers, by pushing this kind of labor, childcare and elder care onto the most vulnerable workers in our economy, who are disproportionately women, and especially women of color, and often immigrant women, who are doing this work for pennies, wages wise. I mean, childcare and elder care are among the lowest paid jobs in the economy. And certainly these are jobs that very rarely come with health insurance, with paid time off, with other types of benefits. And this contributes to the high levels of churn and ultimately undermines the quality of care too.
Well, I'm glad you said quality of care, because that's, none of this is great for outcomes, right? So, I mean, even if you wanted to take kind of a resigned, like, well, we all have our cross to bear kind of approach, like, this isn't a system that works for the people being cared for
Yeah.
either, right? So children under 5 are not thriving in this country. The elderly are not spending their final months and years with dignity and financial stability in this country. So it's really not working for who we're caring for either.
And the irony is that by making those underinvestments, by not investing more in high quality childcare and elder care, we actually undermine people's trust in government to be able to provide those high quality care services. And so it sort of serves, the folks behind the scenes who don't want to spend more money by making people skeptical of whether we could do this at high quality. Even though what we've learned from things like the Lanham Act child care centers in World War II is that with sufficient investments, we can do high quality care, and we can do it at scale. We can do it on a broad level, but it does take substantial investments in ways that, we're often reluctant. Ironically, it's sort of this, circular problem in the sense that the
Yes.
lower the quality on the front end, the less willing we are to invest to get to that higher quality of care.
So interesting. Yeah. I mean, public schools are a perfect example, right? People flee from them when they're not working, and then they work less when people flee from them. And yeah, fascinating. Okay,
Exactly.
so who is benefiting from the way we've structured our society?
Yeah, so in the book, I trace this back to the 1930s and to essentially in the wake of the Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the kind of billionaires and big corporations, at the time, they weren't actual billionaires, more millionaires, but billionaires in today's dollars didn't want to pay for the higher taxes that were needed to fund the sort of New Deal style programs, kind of investments in things like welfare, investments in things like Social Security. And so they set out to find a way to persuade Americans that we didn't need to invest in social safety nets, the way that the New Deal was proposing and the way that some other countries were going as well. And what they found at the time was a group of Austrian economists who were developing what is essentially neoliberal theory, this idea that societies don't need social safety nets, and in theory, at least, are better off without them, because in the absence of protection, so the theory goes, people will make better choices to keep themselves safe from risk. Now, this has been thoroughly debunked with data. This is not actually how people respond to risk, but it was a sticky idea, and it became even stickier in part because these same kind of wealthy business owners that found these Austrian economists worked with elite US universities to find places for them where they would go on to train the next generation of economists and policymakers in the US. And they also, that included folks like Milton Friedman, who is kind of one of the main architects of our modern economy, and also funded massive propaganda campaigns. Things like, the General Electric Theater was kind of came out of this kind of thinking. It was a wildly popular television program that was hosted by Ronald Reagan that launched his career and also helped persuade Americans that we don't need these social safety nets, that we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, despite the irony of that statement, that it's just not physically possible. And also kind of led us to be skeptical of government, led us to be skeptical of kind of this idea that people are universally deserving of dignity, and that instead people should, work for what they get, and that they should be forced to prove that they're deserving of any support from the government, and keeping that as minimal as possible as well. And that's, very much the same model we have today. The specific people and institutions are somewhat different that are involved, but we know that those same billionaires and big corporations, in theory, are the ones who are very much benefiting from our current system. We've sort of laid the groundwork for a a system where, with the exception of kind of Social Security and Medicare, we've dramatically reduced the amount of spending that we've done on, social safety net programs, welfare, and food stamps, and the way that we fund schools and the way that we fund other social infrastructure, especially for, younger people and families with children. Investments in higher education have gone down in ways that have made it harder for average people to get by and left more money in the pockets of those wealthy people and corporations, and prevented it from trickling down the way that folks like Reagan promised that it would.
Well, that reminds me of one of my favorite chapters in the book. By favorite, I mean, it made me the angriest. Was the chapter called Good Choices Won't Save Us. So to talk a little bit about what you mean by that phrase, first of all, good choices won't save us, and what you set out to debunk in that chapter.
Yeah, so people in general and women in particular in our society are often told, if you just make good choices, everything will turn out fine. If you just, stay in school, if you just choose the right college major, if you major in STEM, if you, find a good partner, if you get married, if you wait to have children until the right time, your life will work out the way that you want it to, and maybe you'll be able to avoid some of these, inequalities or some of these hardships that other people in our society have to face. But the reality is, there's sort of two problems with that kind of logic. And the first is that making those good choices often requires a great deal of privilege, that the people who are best able to, invest in higher education or wait to find a partner or avoid pregnancy kind of earlier on in their lives, or even, pursue a career in STEM that often takes a high level of, persistence in the face of pushback. Those are often women from relatively privileged backgrounds who are in a position to make those, quote unquote, good choices to begin with. And then the other challenge here is that even for women who make those good choices, life doesn't always turn out the way that they planned. There are certainly, and I talk in that chapter about women who, on paper made those good choices, who, went to college, who got those degrees, who got married, and still ran into challenges in their lives, whether it was a partner who was, abusive, or whether it was a workplace that was not accommodating of their needs as a mother, or whether it was, challenges that they faced in their community in terms of the level of support that they were able to receive. And so kind of debunking this idea that if we just make these good choices, that will, guarantee us some good outcome in the end, and also highlighting how much privilege it often does take to be able to make those good choices in the first place. What does it mean to have a family who can help you afford to go to college or can help you with a down payment on a house, compared to not being in that same position going forward?
Right. I'm thinking of, I think it was Little Fires Everywhere, where the two characters were arguing and she said, I made good choices. And the other woman said, you had good choices.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So interesting. And talk a little bit about the meritocracy myth. I thought that was really interesting in that chapter.
Yeah, and so this is kind of a related idea that we have this, long-standing belief in our society. I mean, you could trace this all the way to like Ben Franklin, kind of early American writings. This notion that, people who succeed in our society do so because they work hard. And that appeals in theory. It has this sort of nice ring to it that if people are just frugal and make good choices and work hard and have the right mindset, that they'll be able to be successful in our society. And the reality is that that's and not always what predicts success. That certainly successful people have often worked hard to get to where they are, but working hard and having that right mindset in and of itself is often not enough to guarantee success, particularly for those who are up against systematic marginalization or huge hardships, or challenges in their lives. And what the research shows on that front, though, is that buying into this idea, believing this sort of myth of meritocracy, that if you just work hard enough, you'll be successful. It's on the one hand, I talk about it for, it operates somewhat differently for people depending on where they fall on the economic spectrum. For people who are kind of toward the bottom, it almost operates like cigarettes in the sense that like it feels good in the moment. It gives you a sense of hope. It gives you a sense of reassurance. It feels good in the sense that you can believe that there, things are possible. But what the
Yeah.
research shows is that it actually like builds up in the body in ways that can be damaging. It can lead people to then start to blame themselves if they, continually run up against challenges or problems in their lives. And, meanwhile, for people kind of at the top of the spectrum, it operates instead like a gold star. It tells people that like,
Mm.
okay, you deserve to be where you are. If you have more
Mhm.
privileges than everyone else, more advantages, you must have worked really hard to deserve them. So you don't need to do
Mhm.
anything to help people, further down below you because they clearly didn't work as hard as you did.
Right.
And for similar reasons, even for people in the middle of the spectrum, that kind of ideology can lead people, even who would benefit from the social safety net, to reject the need for stronger investments in programs like childcare or, higher wages or national health care, because it offers them a sense of moral superiority over people who need more support from the social safety net than they do. And I talk in
Mhm.
the book about one mom who's a kind of white evangelical Christian mom who is a stay-at-home mom, who, her family actually gets Medicaid, and, relies on government support, but she insists that they don't actually need it, that they could get by without it. Her
Mm.
husband is a pastor at their church, and she kind of says that like, no, like we make frugal choices, we could do this, we could get by, said, we didn't really need the extra money that we got during COVID, and even went so far as to judge other moms, who needed that
Mm.
support, saying that they must have
Mm.
been making bad choices. They must have been spending
Mm.
money. She talked about like getting their nails done or going out and hiring
Mm.
babysitters so they could go partying and drawing on these
Mm.
kinds of stereotypes and these kinds of
Yeah.
assumptions. And in the process came to reject the need for any kind of stronger support system, even
Mm.
if her own family would benefit from that kind of support in terms of,
Mhm.
greater investments in childcare, which might have allowed her to stay in the paid workforce instead of, having to move home, or greater investments in healthcare, which even with Medicaid, she was still having to figure out costs. And, certainly, food prices. She talked about how sometimes she does just eat the crusts of her son's sandwich because that's what they can
Mm.
afford. And so I think
Mm.
this is a place where pushing back against this kind of mythical thinking could help not only to increase people's understanding and awareness of what we could gain from a stronger social safety net, but might
Mhm.
also help to break down some of the, the stereotypes and the barriers that we use to persuade people that some people just aren't deserving of a life with dignity, in ways that lead them to feel better about themselves, but that
Yeah.
ultimately, increase racism and classism and sexism in our society instead.
Right. Yeah. And make it easier to exploit people that we've made to seem, lesser than in some
Yes.
way through that
Yes.
stereotyping. Yeah. Great point. You have a line in the book, unless and until we band together, we're stuck supporting a system designed for someone else's gain. What does that look like to you then, banding together? I know you raised the idea of a union of care. Is that an example of banding
Yeah.
together?
I mean, I think the idea here is that, and people often tell me like, there's like we like our, community. We don't want to give up on our, the informal care that we provide to our neighbors or to our loved
Mhm.
ones. And so what
Mhm.
I'm trying to argue in the book is that the investments that we could make in a stronger social safety net will actually strengthen those informal networks as well, because, there's only so much that we can outsource. Even in
Mhm.
countries that have stronger social safety nets than ours, it doesn't mean that people aren't caring for their children or caring for their elderly family
Right.
members or taking care of their neighbors. But
Right.
this is a place where, if we come together, if we recognize how those networks of care link our fates, how when
Mhm.
we, if we have a colleague who is dealing with an elder care crisis or who has children who are sick and need to stay home, we often are the
Mhm.
ones who have to step in and fill in the gaps for those colleagues. And so
Mhm.
recognizing how breakdowns in our care system, when we fail to invest in policies around care, we hurt all of us, not just the
Mhm.
people who are most directly affected, not just the care providers and the people who immediately need the care, but the whole system gets weaker in the sense that, we have less, it's like less oxygen masks on a plane to go around.
Right.
And so
Right.
in the absence of those, it's very easy for people to scramble to try to put their own on first, as opposed to saying, actually, no, we need more, oxygen masks so that we can all be in a position to help ourselves better and to help each other better as well. And this is where I think, banding together around the value of care, around our kind of shared participation in networks of care, is a way to help people start to reject those myths and come together to demand more support.
Yeah. You're candid in the book that this would be expensive, right? I mean, it would cost money to create a social safety net in this country. So talk about that a little bit and where that money would potentially come from.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is expensive, in the sense that high
Mhm.
quality care, as we know, when we pay for our own childcare, when we pay for our elder care for our loved ones, it does cost a great deal of money, and that money has to come from somewhere. I mean, there certainly are cost savings that could be realized when we do this at scale, as opposed to leaving every community to figure it out for themselves. Though at the
Mhm.
same time, I think it's important to recognize that the money is already there in our economy. It's just oftentimes in the wrong hands.
Mhm.
And it gets at the idea. I actually just gave a presentation at the Wisconsin IRS last
Mhm.
week. In part, some of my other research looks at kind of why rich people behave the way that they do, and in part why they cheat. And what the
Mhm.
research shows on that front is that wealthy people and corporations have gotten very good at manipulating our tax code, both in
Mhm.
terms of the way that they've changed tax laws to benefit themselves, and
Mhm.
also in finding huge tax loopholes to get around when it
Mhm.
comes to avoiding, sometimes even paying taxes at all. And so this creates a system where the tax burden for the existing programs that our society does offer disproportionately falls on middle income and lower income families, and even like upper middle income families. And it's really those people at the top that hold the vast majority of the wealth that are hoarding the most of it, and keeping the
Mhm.
rest of us from having access to the kinds of programs that could be relatively easily affordable on maybe not much of a change in tax structure for the rest of us, if we just
Mhm.
were willing to put in place the kinds of tax policies and enforce them in ways that would make that kind of more feasible going forward. I mean, even one of the ironies is that people are often, in part because of Reagan era rhetoric, very skeptical of the IRS. And what the research actually shows on that front is that the better funded the IRS is, the more they go after high income earners and
Mhm.
taxpayers, and that the less funding the IRS has, it's very expensive to do operations that find super wealthy tax cheats, in part because they
Yeah,
have whole teams of lawyers and accountants that can help them hide their wealth for them. And
sure.
so it costs more money to be able to fight that kind of tax crime, and it's much easier to go after and audit people much lower down on the spectrum, which wastes resources because most of the time they aren't cheating, and also leaves huge buckets of money untouched in terms of the
Mhm.
amount of wealth that is not only being hoarded through the way our tax laws are structured, but just through basic cheating that keeps money in the wrong hands.
Wow. I'm curious if researching and writing this book changed anything about the way you conduct your life and your family.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've been very grateful for my family in the process of writing this book. Like I said, this wasn't a book that I intended to write, in the sense of, I think I had gotten I talked to an editor early on who was encouraging me to write it, and I was like, look, I have this other book that's still due, and I have these two kids at home, and like there's like pandemic going on. I don't know if I can do
Right.
this. And so most of this book got written between like 5 and 7 a.m. before my kids woke up for the day, mostly kind of during the throes of COVID. And that, I think for me, I don't know if it changed necessarily the way that I do things family life wise, but certainly I think talking to my kids about, I think it helped give me a lens into, or a way to talk to my kids about the potential importance of the work that I do, and to say this is
Mhm.
why, why I'm getting up at 5 a.m. to write every day, or why I sometimes have to travel to go talk to folks about the research that I'm
Mhm.
doing, and to help them kind of be more understanding of some of these patterns that I talk about in the book. And they're 10 and 7, so they get it on some level, but I think it's been a good opening for me to talk about that work. And certainly my husband has been a huge help in terms of the logistics on that front, and certainly not feeling guilty. I think maybe that has been a big change, is learning to not feel guilty about expecting and having a fairly egalitarian relationship when it comes
Yeah.
to dividing household responsibilities and childcare, and the daily trade-off that goes from having a partnership with two parents who both work full-time and fairly demanding jobs, with two kids that have their own needs. And I think learning to have those hard conversations, but not to feel
Mhm.
guilty about it in terms of the work involved, and seeing the value that can come out of this too.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about that as a kind of a chicken and an egg thing. And I know we had a couple questions come in advance from viewers who were planning on tuning in, and I'm thinking in particular about the woman who asked if gendered domestic expectations for women, you know, for household work for women are the same in European countries where they have more robust social safety nets. And I'm just thinking as you're talking, is that one of those things where if you don't learn them in the first place, you don't have to unlearn them? Or if you don't know that you're supposed to feel guilty, do you not feel guilty? So do you have any research on that, whether gender expectations are similar or not similar in the European countries with social safety nets?
Yeah, so Caitlin Collins is a sociologist who's done some comparative work across nationally, looking at sort of the experience, especially of kind of more highly educated, affluent moms across different contexts and kind of full-time employed moms. And one of the things that she finds is that the gender ideologies do matter in terms of, there's countries, places like Germany, for example, that have invested more in social safety nets, but still have fairly strong gendered norms that have undermined in some cases the uptake of those programs or the way those programs have been funded to the level of quality that would be needed to give families confidence in not relying on mothers to do the bulk of that work. And so certainly I think gender ideologies do matter, though there's also been some interesting research showing that when countries invest more in these kinds of social safety net programs, that you actually start to see gender attitudes shifting in the sense that, when you have access to universal paid family leave, for example, for both men and women, and when men are incentivized to use those, and when you have men in positions of authority who are, being role models for the men in their companies to take this kind of leave, it can start to shift attitudes. It can start to lead people to adopt more kind of progressive ideas around gender, to kind of recognize the value of care work, to kind of be more active and participatory on those fronts. And I talk about a bit in the book about kind of the case of France, where women and men in France, so there's a smaller gender gap between what men and women are doing, both paid work wise and unpaid work wise, but it's not actually because men are doing more. So men in France are actually doing less of both care work and unpaid work and paid work than men in the US are, in part because they're able to outsource more. And so this is a place where you can essentially achieve greater egalitarianism by investing enough to ensure that people can rely on the support systems around them for a lot of that help, and then be able to have a more equal sharing at home. And that's the kind of circumstance that can help to shift some of those gender attitudes and see more of a sort of an embrace of women and men should be in this together, as opposed to, competing with each other to see who has to do more.
Right. So interesting. And then does that trickle down in a way where the people that we outsource to then are paid and treated in a more egalitarian fashion? I mean, like, are you less exploitive of your nanny, for example, in a country with a better social safety net?
Yeah, I think certainly the Scandinavian countries are kind of the gold standard when it comes to treating both, care recipients and caregivers with a high level of dignity, in the sense of, it does take fairly substantial investments to ensure that work is not exploitative, but it is possible, especially if you couple not only investments in caregiving, but also investments in national health care, in guaranteed paid leave, not only paid family leave, but paid vacation time and limits on paid work hours. If you have sort of a whole system of support, free college and high quality public education systems, that these sort of a sort of mesh or web of support that supports people in all of these different domains helps to ensure that not only are caregivers receiving higher salaries, but they also don't have as many costs that they then have to pay, in terms of their own lives, to access the support that they need, that they, don't have to worry about putting money away for retirement because they have a guaranteed pension, for example. And so even if their salaries, might not be as high as some other jobs, they can still have a fairly high level of stability and security because they don't have to worry about healthcare costs. They don't have to worry about retirement. They don't have to worry about, the needs of the elderly in their own families or the needs of the children in their own families. And so these are ways that it doesn't always show up necessarily just in wages, but in the level of things that people don't have to worry about in their own lives, that they can sort of take off the table, and ways that in the US, ironically, it's often the most affluent workers who get the most benefits. They're the ones who disproportionately have access to paid family leave from their employers, who disproportionately have access to childcare benefits or to health insurance benefits, in ways that essentially we make it expensive to be poor in this country, in ways that other countries have stepped in to address that problem, in ways that wages, they still matter, but don't matter quite as much because there's a higher level of support that makes poverty less costly or that makes precarity less costly for those who are facing lower wages overall.
Yeah, so interesting. Uh, are there ways that those of us, gathered tonight listening can conduct our lives, our work lives, our family lives, our outsourcing lives to contribute a little bit less to this way of doing things, or chip away at it, that maybe we're not thinking of? I mean, we can't, specifically change tax code overnight. I suppose you could argue that based on our votes, we can contribute or not contribute to that. But what are some ways that we can examine, our daily choices that would solve rather than contribute to some of what you're talking about tonight?
Yeah, I think one key thing that all of us can do every day is check ourselves when we or others around us engage in mythical thinking. When we catch
Mm,
ourselves falling into that mindset of, people should just make better choices. Or,
mm,
when we fall into that notion of, well, I'm just, better at this, so I might as well just do this task as opposed to asking somebody else, for help or kind of put in.
mhm.
So thinking about the moments in our lives or when we hear other people fall into that kind of mythical thinking and being willing to be a little brave and call that out and say, hey, is that
Yeah.
really what's going on here? And that's a place where we can start to free ourselves from some of the guilt, and where we
Hmm.
can start to reduce some of the judgment that often crops up, particularly in mom spaces, as well.
Mm,
Judging others less, and thinking instead about what might be going on behind the scenes. What are the structural challenges that someone might be facing in their lives, and what could I do to help? Is a good place to start there. And then I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, so much of the energy that, especially when we're in those mom spaces, for example, like Facebook moms groups or other types of, online communities or even, PTO type communities, so much of the energy that happens in those spaces is very much focused on, how do I help my own individual kid, or how do I, try to figure out the challenge that I'm dealing with. And that's a place where we could take some of that energy and put it to more collective ends and think about, okay, which one of us is going to run for local office, or which one of
mm,
us is going to, start the organization to work toward solving this local problem that we need to fix. And how do we support that person? How do we, become their campaign managers? How do we think about supporting the organization that they're running? How do we do this sustainably? How can we all be more active participants in a shared project of care? And I think that's a place where, to the extent that we can think about where we're spending our energy and our time and our money and how we might direct that toward ways that, as long as we still live in a democracy and we have the chance to participate and to push for change, how can we do that most effectively? And often that means coming together, remembering that there's more that we share than what divides us, and
mhm,
using our voices together to fight for those kinds of better policies for care.
mhm. I love that. So this wasn't the book that you set out to write. You mentioned that, and you're clear about that in the book too. Um, do you, but at the end of writing it, and also in these conversations that you're engaged in now, right? I mean, you're on a book tour. Um, do you feel less or more hopeful about America, about our future, about our ability to come together and recognize our connectedness than you did before you started writing it?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there was a moment early on in the writing process, when we'd maybe just gotten some of the new COVID programs and when Build Back Better was on the table, and I felt really, really hopeful that, like, this, like, we're on this. This is going to be the story of like how we finally figured this out. And then there was a moment in 2022 where I got really depressed, and I was like, this is clearly not going in the direction that I thought it was. Build Back Better was off the table. We had the Dobbs decision. There were lots of other kind of related decisions that, left me a little less hopeful. But in the
Mm-hmm.
process of finishing the book, and in the process especially of, thinking about what the message was that I wanted to send to readers at the end, in terms of, investing in care, in terms of thinking about, what it would take for us all to come together, and certainly in terms of the conversations that I've had with folks around this story. I think that has left me with a great deal of hope about the broad level of support that we have in this country for these kinds of investments in better care policies. The fact that people are sort of hungry to understand, how did we get here and how do we move forward from here? Sometimes that does look like looking for someone to blame. And I try to give a little of that too in the book, in terms of like, there actually are some villains here that we can point to. And sometimes having someone to be mad at is incredibly empowering. Some of the women that I've talked to in this book, say like, well, I want to read this, but I don't want to I'm worried that I will get too angry. And
Yeah.
sometimes anger, though, is what it takes to give us the courage to fight for the hard things, and the important things. And that's,
Right.
that's part of what gives me hope, is that this can both be a book that, that does make you angry, but that hopefully offers some hope and some, a path forward at the end that we can invest in, and that can get us to a place where we maybe don't have to be as angry or fight as much,
Yeah.
going forward.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the Gloria Steinem quote, right? The truth will
Yes,
set you free, but first it'll piss you off.
indeed, indeed.
Hi, Lonnie.
Hey, Heidi. Hey, Jason.
Hi.
So much for a great interview, Heidi. I appreciate how you walked everyone through so many of the different pieces that come up in the book. Thank you for your very thoughtful preparation, as always. There's so much that can be unpacked here in my brain. I've got at least 3 questions of my own here. I want to, first of all, remind folks that Jessica and Heidi are going to be joining us at After Hours. It's going to begin at 8:05 Central in about 11 minutes from now. You can come to After Hours, buy a copy of this great book. It's right up here holding it together. Buy a copy from our partner bookseller. We've been putting links in chat to buy a copy. In that email receipt, you'll see the link to register for After Hours, and come hang out, ask your own questions. You have access to a brilliant researcher who has looked at these things very, very carefully, and is obviously able to answer a whole lot of questions that are from a lot of different perspectives. So great opportunity right there. I want to ask, I have one question of my own, and then one I want to kind of pivot a little bit from someone who submitted a question earlier. So I'll start with her, just to give her dealer's choice right there, which is that I'm wondering if you had any thoughts or any perhaps even research, maybe not, from women who have stepped out of the workforce while their children were very young, and are perhaps, and spent a lot of time maybe doing a lot of volunteer work, doing a lot of community work, to stay engaged, smart, educated women who are wanting to now step back in. Are you seeing any particular forces at play there in terms of the re-engaging in the workplace, and any particular advice that you might want to offer? And we got about 3 minutes for that. And I can ask my question After Hours, so I'll just wait.
Yeah, and this is a really challenging place for, yes, some of the women that we talked to for the book, were in that position where they had stepped out of the workforce, where they, when their children were young. And what we know is that women often, when their kids are ready for kindergarten or when they go into preschool, that this is often a time when they start to think about, whether it's going from part-time to full-time, or whether it's going back into the workforce at all. And so many workforces and so many families are not set up in ways to make that an easy transition. And this is a place where, unfortunately, the kind of boss that you have, or the kind of job that you're in, and also the partner that you have, end up mattering a great deal in terms of how easy or how difficult that transition will be. That can be a place where, if your partner is very used to you doing all the things the way that Dennis was with Bethany, it's probably going to be some roadblocks in the way of trying to re-enter the workforce, because you're probably still going to be expected to do all of the things at home, especially if the kind of job that you're moving back into doesn't afford you a great deal of purchasing power when it comes to, bargaining power within your relationship. And that's, unfortunately, a very challenging reality for a lot of women who try to go that route. And certainly there are some employers who are much better, and who recognize the value that women can bring, even when they've been, focused on other things, whether it's caregiving responsibilities or organizing responsibilities, or, there's so much value to the labor that women are often doing as caregivers, as organizers, as community volunteers, and finding ways to package that and help employers to see that value, is certainly a step that some women have had success with, though it's important still to recognize that there are big barriers on that front, and that many employers are skeptical of hiring women. And the research on that front, unfortunately, shows that there are substantial motherhood penalties that women face. And this is one of the sort of revolving door problems in terms of women often get pushed into the kinds of careers that do have, frequent openings. This is part of why many of the women that I talk to chose careers in education or nursing or childcare or social work, because they knew there would always be jobs available, even if they took time off. But that then helps to justify the low wages that go with those types of work too. So it's a sort of chicken and egg problem there.
Yeah, it is tough, especially because then, especially if you feel like maybe your skill sets are a little rusty, and especially at the rate at which, the workplace has changed so much, even in the last 5 years, where you can kind of feel like if you've been gone even 6 months, you're kind of wondering, am I still up to speed? Much less if you've been out 5 years or 6 or 7 years. Be really tough. We're at 8 o'clock. I want to thank both of you so much for a great conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing you in about 5 minutes at After Hours. Thanks everybody for joining us, and hope to welcome you back to FAN next week. Come see Oliver Berkman and Dan Pink. It's gonna be a great event. So thanks everyone. Good night.